Hey YouTube, how is it going? I hope all is well. Today we're going to talk a bit about why you do not need a standby switch or do not need to use a standby switch in your amplifier, especially if you have a tube rectified amplifier. I guess first it's helpful to start with the history of the standby switch first. So back in the olden days, when I was a wee young grasshopper, I kid, I'm not that old. But in either case, back when amplifiers were first kind of being built, in the early part of the 1940s and into the early part of the 1950s, they were all tube rectified, okay? So they all had a tube rectifier. There was no such thing as solid state really at the moment, or at that time. So all of the amplifiers originally had a tube rectifier. They also were lower wattage and did not have standby switches. We're talking early Fender Champs, we're talking Supros, all the different, Valco made amplifiers of that era, right? I think Valco and whatnot made I think there was like 10 different brands that they were a part of. They had the Sears brand, Ahua and whatnot, all those different ones, but beside the point. And then in the early part of the 1950s, for some reason, Fender decided that he was going to start putting in standby switches. And that just started the whole trend towards going with standby switches. All of the amp makers started doing it. Marshall copied it. Vox, of course, is guilty of it. And then we move on into the modern era. And even, amp makers like Dave Friedman, Ignator, Bogner, etc., they all use standby switches in most of their designs, even though they probably don't really need it. It's just turned into this thing of ubiquity for no real good reason, to be honest. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that if your amplifier has a tube rectifier in it, you do not need that standby switch at all. You may as well just bridge a wire across there and pull the switch out altogether, whatever. Now, there's a multitude of reasons why. I'm only going to go over a couple of them, but the predominant reason why you don't really want to use a standby switch, Brad the Guitologist has talked about this, Psionic Audio has talked about this, I'm sure Carlton's Lab, and a couple others have probably also talked about it, briefly in one way or another. I'm hoping I can make it a little bit clearer for some people as to why you don't need it, what are some of the problems, of having it, and some of the other topologies, and as to why having a standby switch at all can be good and or bad, right? Okay, I'm going to try to be fair on both sides of the argument. But let's stick with this. This is similar in design to one of the amps that I make. This is an 18-watt light. Mark Huss has created this schematic. It's open on the web. You can find it anywhere. But in either case, this is basically what an 18-watt Marshall schematic would look like. And you'll notice here that they've got a standby switch here. Now, what is so bad about having the standby switch there? Well, the problem is that this guy right here, I'm going to call this a safety mechanism. All it really is just a bleed down resistor. So all this resistor does is allow the high voltage that's stored within these capacitors here to shunt away to ground and to leave the capacitors. Basically, these capacitors will bleed down to 0 volts so you can get your grubby little fingers inside this amp and start touching things with impunity. That's really all it's there for. Why that's bad, though, is because when this amp, let's say you turn the amp on first, like most people do, with the standby in the off position like it is currently, this cathode here gets all warmed up, so the heaters and all the tubes warm up, and this tube gets ready to provide all of its available current and electrons freely at will. It does so, and then you close this switch. All of a sudden, all of those angry pixies in there are trying to run through this circuit here to fill up and charge all of these capacitors, which we have already ascertained at this point are down at 0 volts. Essentially, they look like a ground to this tube rectifier here. And by ground, I mean a direct short to ground. because it essentially is as far as things go. You're taking a lot of voltage potential here, and you're trying to plug it into something that has no voltage potential at all. And that causes a butt ton of stress on this tube right here. What you can see happen inside of the tube is arcing. You'll see it look like a little light show for a moment. And really what it is there's so much voltage and energy, trying to blast through this thing to go do its job, that it jumps the gap. It breaks through its dielectric elements that, protect each of the elements within this thing, right? And you see that as an arc. Now, what happens is every time you get an arc inside of the tube, and it's not just EZ81s, it's all of them, but anytime you get an arc, what it's actually doing is blasting away on the coating that they put over the plates in the cathodes, right? There's like a little coating that they put on these things. Some of them have like some sort of like a ceramic thing on them. But whatever that coating is starts to break away and, fall off the elements within inside this envelope here. And it also ionizes that material, and it causes the tube to, in a way, go gassy, if you will, right? So the more it does it, the more prevalent it will be to do it. And eventually it's going to get to a point where it is no longer able to be controlled. And what will happen is that tube will light up like a Christmas tree, and it will continue to arc across there until it, goes into full-on electron meltdown. Very ungood. Failing rectifiers can take out, power transformers. It can do some nasty things to the B+ supply. It can get in on, it can burn up screen grids. It can burn up output transformers. It can do things that are ungood. It can. It's not very common, but it can. So objectively, we want to make the life on this tube as easy as possible. How do we do that? Well, there's a couple different ways to do it. The easiest way is to just basically put the standby switch in the closed position or the on position and just operate the amp entirely from the power switch altogether. Now, why is that a good thing? Well, tubes require time to warm up, right? So the heater in here warms up the cathode, and as it warms up the cathode, it slowly allows that tube to come to operating, potential, right? Well, if this is closed, that means it's also going to take these and charge them up slowly as it needs to do so. And then as it gets to full operating potential, so will these already be there. These they'll work in tandem with the rectifier and do what it needs to do. That makes this guy very happy. It doesn't have any unnecessary load on it, and it just does what it needs to do naturally. That's great. The other way that you can kind of make this thing's life a little bit easier is to go with this other type of design, which Fender has implemented on several of theirs. So same principle here. You've got your rectifier tube, and you got a standby switch, but you'll notice that this standby switch here is on the other side of the capacitor. So this is the primary reservoir cap right here, right? So this is the reservoir cap that's doing the bulk of the work. This one here has, all the charge stored in it, and it helps make sure that the rest of these other 5 capacitors in here are doing their job. Not any different than this guy here. Same kind of difference. This guy here is the primary reservoir cap, and its job is to help smooth the electron, smooth the voltage and the ripple, right, that gets out onto the rest of these other preamp tubes. This is the noisiest node in the entirety of the amp, and it smooths out the ripple, and then this guy gets involved and it smooths it out a little bit more, and then this guy smooths it out yet a little bit more, etc., etc., right? So objectively, by the time you get to these guys here, your very first preamp tube, which is the most sensitive tube in your amp, the ripple is very, very smooth. We'll talk about that in another video in more detail, but for this one, all we need to know is that we want to make the life on this tube rectifier easy as it can be. This guy here, the very first reservoir capacitor, is the one doing the bulk of the, the ripple control or ripple management. And it is also the one that, does the most damage to you, if you will, to the rectifier tube when there is no energy being stored within this capacitor. Now, in this orientation here, where the standby switch is after the reservoir cap, it's not as bad on the tube rectifier in this instance. So what happens is as you turn on the AC switch here with the standby switch off, the tube warms up, does what it needs to do, and then it charges up this capacitor. So this capacitor here is charged up. It's ready to go. And then when you close the switch, this guy here will then help take some of the load, some, not all, some of the load off of the rectifier to then charge up all these other capacitors. Now this is it might only take milliseconds of time to actually charge all these up, even from 0. That's not the point. The point is that this guy then has a much harder life, and it still doesn't take all the brunt off of the tube rectifier to charge all these guys up. There is an inrush current. It causes a lot of work on these two elements right here, and that is not good. Again, if you were to just wire this guy shut and never touch the standby switch, and then just use the AC switch when you need to use the amp and turn it off when you don't need to use the amp, these guys here would live a much better life, because as this guy warms up, it would charge this guy, and it would charge all the subsequent caps as it needed to, as this thing comes up to operating potential. By the time this thing actually does any kind of work at all to actually do the job it's supposed to do, these guys are already waiting and ready to do what they need to do. And then by then, of course, all the rest of the tubes have warmed up to the degree where they're ready for, you know, everything to operate as well. So I like tube rectifiers. I like them because they're simple. I like the way they sag. I like the way that they operate, right? Because they're basically like a slow start circuit. Now, there are analog or solid state versions of that kind of have the same sort of thing going on. And it's not that they're bad. They work great. They also have them so that they emulate, you know, the sag of a tube rectifier. That's all there too. But why go through all that extra trouble when this guy right here does it already, right? So that is why these guys here just really should just always have the standby switch out of circuit or always on, right? Or just removed altogether. Now let's get into something a little bit different. This one is kind of a two-parter because, again, it can implement two different ways to do this, but there's a reason why it's really egregious in this particular amp. This is, if you're not already familiar with this circuit, a GACM 800 design. This is the 2204. It's the 50-watt model, right? Now, you'll notice down here, the standby switch is before the rectifier. This one uses solid-state rectification, so that's what these 4 diodes here are. That's the solid-state rectifier. And then it goes into the primary reservoir capacitor through an HT fuse and then on through the rest of the circuit, right? Now, why is this so bad right here? Well, again, this, you know, when you close this, it's not as bad with solid-state rectification because the solid-state rectifiers don't care, right? When you turn them on, they are ready to go. It is instant on, just like that. Sorry, some ASMR for you right here. Got my Dr. Pepper, we're good to go. All right, so now why is it bad in this particular amp though? There are some amps where having some sort of protection circuit or slow start circuit, if you will, is ideal. And the reason for this particular amp is this guy right here, the cathode follower. Now, if you notice something about this, the grid and the plate are connected directly to HT in one way or another. So when you turn this standby switch on, there is no warm-up time. The power is there right now, which means that this tube hasn't had a chance yet to warm up. So in this instance, it would be ideal to have a standby switch because then you could turn it off. When you turn the amp on, it'll allow the tube some time to warm up and allow them to flow electrons like they are meant to. And then when you hit the standby switch, this guy will take a few moments to charge, as well as the rest of the other reservoir caps. They'll take their, you know, their couple milliseconds or whatever it takes to charge. And this guy here will just operate like normal. No big deal. So it kind of makes sense in this instance to have a standby switch. However, it's really kind of pointless because now you've just implemented something to just implement it, right? It doesn't have to be there. Now, the only reason that's a problem is because let's say we were to get rid of the standby switch and just wire it hot, right? When you turn it on, these guys right here now have 348 and 182 volts respectively going into the plate and to the grid. And those angry pixies are trying to flow around in this tube and do something. They're trying to go somewhere, right? But they can't quite do it, so they fight amongst each other. And what can ultimately happen is this thing will actually arc as it tries to short itself out, literally internally, because it's got so many volts that are just built up in there, just doing nothing. So what can happen is it can burn out the grid, and the grid, when it breaks, right, if it shorts, arcs enough, it'll break the grid, and then the grid can short to the plate or the cathode. That would be ungood. That can cause some serious problems. Not common though. We talk about it as if this thing is, it's happening every day. It's not really common. It's just that it's not good for the tubes. And given that there's still, this is another topic of discussion we're going to have, but given that there's still a thing for, NOS tubes or whatever, it's, in vintage tubes and stuff like that, whatever, you want to try to be gentle on them if you can, right? They're not cheap. Aside from that, though, it's just bad to be bad to tubes, right? We don't want to be mean to them if we don't need to be. So yeah, it would be nice to have a slow start circuit in this particular design, but there is a way around that. And that is by going to something like this. Merlin Bencrow, I apologize if I mess up your name, Mr. Merlin. The Valve Wizard, we cannot miss that. He's got a bunch of different little white pages, if you will, on all kinds of different things tube amp related. And this circuit right here is one such circuit that helps immensely in extending the life of this particular tube, which is the cathode follower in this, in the JCM 800 and many other amps. But let's just say that the JCM 800 is one of the more egregious type of designs that has a huge following, right? And when we talk about Friedmans, Bogners, Ignators, and all those other different modern era, amplifiers, most of them are modified Marshalls, right? And being that they're modified Marshalls, most of them have solid state rectifiers, and most of them implement a cathode follower. So again, going away from the whole don't need a standby switch, it makes sense to then implement other parts if you do get rid of the standby switch to help maintain the life of a tube. This is one of those circuits. So what happens is when you turn on the amplifier, all that voltage starts to come in here. So you got your 3+100 volts that comes in, and all this resistor here does is help slow down some of the current. It manages some of that current so it doesn't just blast on in there. And then these two little bits right here, this 10K and this 1N4007, this diode, right? All that does is allow the electrons to then flow out of the circuit and away from the grid. When this tube is able to conduct, so after the heater has heated up the cathode and it can conduct, all it does is shut off the ability for anything to flow in the opposite direction. So it keeps this diode, makes it so that no current can flow from the cathode into the grid of the tube. So this part right here essentially turns off once the tube is able to operate like normal. And it's great because it works really well in protecting the cathode follower of this, amplifier setup from being damaged by just sending it the beans right off the get-go, which then allows you to get away from having to use a standby switch. But then you go, okay, well, what about all these other parts up here? You now got 300 volts, 400 volts or whatever, sitting on the plate of your tube doing nothing. It's got no way to conduct, right? It's not that big a deal, really. You would like to think that it's harmful on these guys. Some people they go on about like cathode stripping and other different, mythical things like that. Those types of problems don't exist unless you have several, like not tens of thousands, but like thousands of volts, right? So if you were to, I can't remember, but there's like a way to have it happen. There are different tubes that operate literally with 1,000+ volts on their plates, right? And those are definitely for like radio, old radio stations and stuff like that that used to have, thousands upon thousands of watts worth of power to transmit radio waves, right? So those types of amps did have a problem with cathode stripping and other things like that. What do they call it? There's another term I can't remember, but basically where you spoil the tube's ability to work. Not so much the case when you're working at voltages below 400 volts in these tubes. They're designed to work at these voltages, no problem. And having a bunch of high voltage sitting here, it doesn't have anything to arc to. It can't go anywhere, so it doesn't hurt anything really. Really, that's all there is to it. They're not bothered by it. So turning them on, and then of course, it only takes a couple seconds for the tubes to warm up and start doing something, right? So, as the heater warms up, it slowly starts conducting, and then everybody happy. So, again, you don't need a standby switch in an amp like this. You can get away with using a circuit like this to make it so you don't need a standby switch. Again, obviously, not everybody has this type of circuitry. And when I say that, I mean this type of circuitry in their amp designs and, whatever. More or less, all I'm getting at is that realistically, you do not have to worry about leaving the standby switch in the on position all the time, or closed position, right? And then when you need to use the amp, you turn on the mains, or you turn on the, you turn the amp on. And when you don't want to use it, you just turn the amp off. You're going to be fine. In most amplifiers, especially ones that are tube rectified, it is actually better to not use the standby switch. Period. Every time you open this thing up, it causes stress on all these other parts because they do bleed away to ground. Maybe not so much in this amp. This one doesn't have the safety mechanism. Remember, I was talking about that earlier. This guy right here. Most modern amps do implement something like this. Now, what this is designed to do, as I mentioned, is to take the high voltage that's stored within this capacitor and allow it to shunt away into ground. Which means that if you turn the amp off into standby, that means that these guys bleed off down to 0 volts, and every time you flick that switch, it's a big inrush of current. All of a sudden, all that current needs to try to fill up all these capacitors all at once, and that's harmful. It's harmful to the transformer. It can internally arc, and it's harmful to the switch because the switch can also arc, and depending on the topology of the amp, it can cause other parts to break down prematurely. It's not as bad on this end here because this is low voltage side. So remember, we're converting voltage for current, right? So on this side here, it's not as harmful because it's not high voltage. Over here, it can be kind of hurtful because there's a lot of voltage. And it's, essentially we're trying to create DC volts on this side, although it's not DC volts sitting on this standby switch. But again, not the point really. So to sum everything up, if you have an amplifier that has a tube rectifier in it, I dare you to just leave the standby switch in the on position all the time. Don't bother with it. Just leave it on. And if you need to mute the amp, just hit the power switch and, do what you need to do. And then turn the amp back on, wait a couple seconds, obviously, as it warms up, and then you're off to the races. In the case where you have solid state rectifiers, 50-50. Choose it or not. I would say it doesn't really matter if you use it or not in an amp like this. But, it's better to not than it is to use it. It's better to not use it than it is to use it, is more or less what I'm saying. And then, obviously, if you're building an amplifier, and you have to have, if you're just, you just cannot convince yourself to build your amp without a standby switch, for the love of God, build it like this one, okay? Build it so that your reservoir cap is directly before anything else, before the standby switch. Do it like this. So if you're imagining this guy here, you would have to copy this circuit again. So you'd have another, another reservoir cap, and then you'd put it here, right? And then you move this standby switch in between that other reservoir cap and this guy here, this A node, right? So if you do it like this, it's better than doing it like this or this. Bad. Really bad. Now, why is this one really bad? I talked about it before already. because this one is actually allowing all of these guys to, you know, bleed all of their voltage away or out from them. When you go and you turn this standby switch, every time you turn it on, it's pretty much a dead short as far as this guy is concerned. Very, very bad. While it's good for safety when you're futzing around in an amplifier, realistically, you shouldn't be digging around in an amplifier anyway, unless you know what you're doing. I think they really just put this in there to try to add like a level of comfort for, you know, the regular Joes that want to try to do home repairs and stuff like that, because a tech worth their snot could care less if this guy was there. They would, you know, do what they need to do to discharge all of these anyway, or they just wouldn't do anything that would harm them. You know, if you keep your fingers out of the amp, it's hard to get hurt. So doing it like this, really, really, really bad. Really, it's worse than doing it like this, but if you have to put one in, do it like this, okay? Objectively, if you're gonna make an amp that has you know, a tube rectifier in it, I'd say get rid of the standby switch altogether and just be happy. You can still implement this little safety guy right here. That's okay. You can still put this in here. And in an amp where you have tube rectifier and you get rid of the standby switch, this is actually a great way to do it. This doesn't hinder performance in any way, doesn't harm anything. Because as the amp as the tube starts to conduct and work, this guy basically gets out of the way. It does what it needs to do for the rest of the rectifiers, the rest of the capacitors, and everybody's happy. So that's really all there is to it. I dare you to look into it a little bit more. Watch some more videos. Watch some of the Psionic audio clips. Watch the, Brad the Guitologist has a thing on it. I'm sure Mr. Carlton's lab has a thing on it. And then, of course, try to find... nowadays, I feel like there's many more websites that are kind of explaining it in better detail as to why you don't really need it. It used to be many, many years ago that when you read about standby switches, they all told you to use it and how to use it, right? Nowadays, I feel like they've kind of gone the other way with it on why they're not as needed as we think they are and how not to use it, right? That's it. So thank you so much. I'll see you on the next one. If you like this, subscribe and hit like, and there's always more coming. So thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.